And so it's this idea that if ministry work is hard, if being a minister's wife is hard, it's because you haven't surrendered yourself fully to God for it. And so it puts the blame on the pastor's wife that she's not doing this right. Gail McDonald, that's her name. But I don't think she meant it to be a chastisement against women. I think it's honestly what she came to believe, that this job is so hard, it has to be a calling from God. And the only way to do it is if you are fully pulling from the power of God.
Welcome to Theodisc, the podcast of WTC Theology. I'm your host, Kenny Innes. In order to defend a theology that says that leadership is not available to women, the role of women and their service in leadership in the Gospels, the early church, and the history of the church has often been hidden, forgotten, or dismissed. In the 20th century, the role of the pastor's wife was equated with a ministry calling in itself, not as a leadership role, but to support and uphold the ministry of the male pastor. And in some quarters, this intensive service to a male leader's ministry was considered the highest calling available to a woman. But what about women who, although married to pastors, might have a God-given calling different from their husbands? What about women who themselves are called to be pastors? Beth Allison Barr is our guest on this episode, and she'll explore with us the ways that the ministry of women is valid without being attached to or subsumed by the role of men. Beth Allison Barr is the James Vardaman Endowed Professor of History at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. She holds a BA from Baylor and an MA and PhD, both from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is a historian who focuses on women and religion in medieval and early modern England, and is the author of The Pastoral Care of Women in Late Medieval England, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and the book that is the basis of this episode, Becoming the Pastor's Wife. Enjoy. Beth Allison Barr, it's wonderful to have you on the Theodisc podcast. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is fun.
Yeah, it's great. So I know you've had a busy period here, and we're going to be talking about the book that you're kind of talking all over the place about at the moment, which is a book called Becoming the Pastor's Wife. Many of our listeners will be aware of your previous work on the making of biblical womanhood. Mm-hmm. And so it's a real privilege to get to talk to you about this. But before we get on to that, you have to pass the test of 3 questions that we ask every first-time guest on the podcast.
Sure.
And I'm not saying that your answers depend on whether we keep talking or not, but it may have an influence. So we want to ask you 3 things that are constants or things that you return to. And the 3 categories are a book, a food or a meal, or a place or a location. So let's go first with a book that you return to.
Oh, yeah. Wilkie Collins, The Moonstone.
Oh, wow.
I love that book, and I love Wilkie Collins. And so it's funny. It's different from, it's a comfort food book. So I read Wilkie Collins frequently. I'll throw Elizabeth Gaskell in there too. I also go back to Elizabeth Gaskell.
Amazing. And a food or a meal that you return to?
Well, as I'm standing here with my coffee, I can say coffee is always one. I am in Texas, and so Tex-Mex, of course. And so Tex-Mex, especially tacos and queso, are definitely comfort foods.
It's the one thing that I miss from living in Texas. You just can't get Tex-Mex food here in the UK.
You cannot. And people try, like when I'm over there, they take me and they're like, oh, this is a really good Tex-Mex place. And I'm like,
Now, in your book, though, I was intrigued because you did talk about your world famous brownies and also kind of chocolate mousse with a strawberry thing in it.
So, yes. So I have been in church circles for long enough that I have to know how to bake things relatively quickly. And I lived with students for, 6 years. And so I did. I don't even know how many hundreds of brownies that I made for them. In fact, I made so many brownies that it's really hard for me to make or eat brownies right now.
Right. Overdone it.
I overdid it. Yeah. Waffles too. I told my kids I wasn't going to make waffles for a long time.
Well, what about a place or a location that you return to?
So actually, you're going to like this. In 2001, when I first went to the UK for my dissertation, I worked in Shrewsbury, in the Public Records Office in Shrewsbury. And I also worked on a series of sermons that are connected to the vicar at St. Alkmund's Parish Church in Shrewsbury. He was at Lilshall Abbey. And there is a 14th century little house right by St. Alkmund's in the middle of Shrewsbury that is now a coffee shop. It survived COVID. It's called the Bear Steps. And every time I'm in the UK, I will go there at least once and just sit there and have a latte in front of St. Alkmund's Parish Church. It's when I'm like, okay, I need to de-stress. That's what I always picture is that little square in front of St. Alkmund's. So
brilliant. Okay, you've done pretty well. I think we can continue.
You can continue. I passed the test.
Okay, it's always good if you put something in about the UK or Scotland. I'm a sucker for that, so you're good. You figured it out early, Beth.
Yes, there we are. Helps to be a British historian, right?
Yeah, right. So, your latest book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife. Now, this is not just theory for you. You're actually writing from personal experience. So, can you tell us a little bit about that phrase, that title, The Pastor's Wife, how that means more than just describing someone's marital situation?
Absolutely. And that's actually part of what this book is about, is sort of deconstructing of, can I use that term here? It's an academic term before it became an evangelical term. Sure. But in thinking historically about the phrase, the pastor's wife, because in fact, like sometimes when you mention this to people, they're like, well, of course, there's always been pastors' wives because there's always been people married to men in ministry. And that's true, yes. But at the same time, what the pastor's wife has become is actually a ministry role itself that is characterized by being unpaid and requiring with a job description that is often unclear, never written down, and changes from church to church. And so it actually has become a very specific type of job that I would argue is one of the most stressful ministry positions, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I was worked at a church in Texas for about 12 and a half years, and the senior pastors, the wife, she was always resisting the title, the pastor's wife. She was always saying, that's not what I am, because I think she was trying to avoid that kind of connection with it's kind of something that's a lot of expectations that come along with that.
That's exactly right. I've met a lot of women who say, yes, I'm married to the pastor, but I'm not a pastor's wife. Yeah. And so it clearly shows that this is a designated title.
Yeah. Now, if you go to your supermarket, especially at the moment, everybody loves a 2-for-1 deal.
Yes, they do. Buy one, get one, BOGO, right? Right.
But in terms of kind of men who are entering the ministry, how does this affect their wives, and how does it become an injustice when it comes to wives of male pastors?
I've been really surprised by the reception of this book. In some ways, it continues arguments that I made in The Making of Biblical Womanhood about the what I would consider to be the dangers of complementarian theology. However, Becoming the Pastor's Wife is being much better received in more conservative circles. And I think it is because of how this book really exposes the injustice of the pastor's wife for these women who have lived this. And in fact, the phrase 2-for-1, I knew I had to name one of my chapters that, because every single woman who was a pastor's wife that I talked to and told that I was writing this book, that would be the first thing they would say to me. They would say, are you going to talk about it being 2-for-1? And so this is simply this practice that is usually, some churches it is written down, but it's this practice that when the husband is hired, the wife is hired too. And that part of his job performance is actually the work that she does. And so if she does something that the church doesn't like, it can also reflect badly on her husband, and in some cases even lead to the firing or the sanctioning against her husband. And then, of course, the fact that her labor is not does not receive a paycheck. And so what he's required to do for the job often includes the expectations that his wife is going to do extra work also. And so, in fact, it leads to such a problem that it's one of the reasons why churches, I think, today are still reluctant to hire female pastors. Because when you get a female pastor, her husband is often not expected to do the same type of work and actually very rarely contributes in the same sort of ministry way. And so a church literally gets less when they hire a female pastor because they do not get that 2-for-1 labor.
Yeah, so in the South, in the US, can you describe what that labor might look like that the wife might be expected to contribute?
Yeah. It can be a whole variety of things. Usually it's connected to the ministry. So it can be like, for example, what I start the book off with is this very amusing conversation that I had with an older wife of a pastor who had retired, who explained to me that she was still doing the bulletin in their church because their new pastor wasn't married yet. And so she was continuing this administrative labor. From her perspective, was just simply part of being a pastor's wife. And it just, really struck me like, here this is, this pastor who's not even married yet. But the expectation is that when he does get married, because that's part of the expectation too, is that he will get married. And when he does, his wife will take on this administrative unpaid labor without, even asking her if that's something she wants to do, willing to do, etc. So a lot of this labor is administrative tasks. A lot of it is what we would consider to be sort of pastoral care ministry, like the wife is expected to set up the dinners or to set up sort of the outreach or to set up even, ways like discipling networks or mentoring networks. She automatically is supposed to be doing that, especially for the other women in the church. Sometimes it is directly ministry related, like she's expected to take over teaching classes or working in the nursery and the children's or any sort of ministry, sometimes even just the women's ministry. She's supposed to take over and become an active part in doing this. And then she's required to go to almost every event. Now, this is the thing I heard all the time from women, that if they missed an event, they would immediately hear about it like, oh, well, where were you? Why weren't you here? And really the only acceptable reason to miss an event is because you have a sick kid or something that involves a conflict with your children. And any other reason is not really considered sufficient for missing a church activity.
And there seems to be this pressure as well that they're held up as the role model for all other women in the church.
Yeah. And, what I found that was so fascinating, that was something that my gut told me was correct, being a pastor's wife. And, I read essentially 60 years of pastor's wife conference material, so material written by pastor's wives for other pastor's wives, as well as 150 pastor's wife books. But it wasn't until I ran across a book that was published in, I'm trying to remember, I think, in the 2000s, relatively recently. And it's a book on ordination in the North American church. And I cited it in the text. I cited it in chapter 7 when I came to this realization. And one of the things that it did is it talked with churches that do not ordain women. And it would ask questions, well, how do you feel about being in a church that does not support women in ministry? And the response that they received, which I think surprised the researchers too, was that the church was like, well, of course we support women in ministry. Look at our pastor's wife. And so the pastor's wife literally becomes, the most recognizable woman in ministry, but also seems to cover the absence of women in ordained professional ministry roles.
Yeah. So in some senses, this kind of becomes a consolation that's held out to women where in environments where they're not given opportunities to lead, but here's something that you can aim for.
Yeah. And I would say that actually it has become, in many of these conservative places, it's been seen as the highest ministry role for women. And so you can be called to ministry, but the highest calling is being called to marry a minister. And that has become the most important role that women can hold, which means that in many of these spaces, it's seen as being more important hierarchically than women who are serving independently in ministry roles.
Yeah. So what does that do then to the autonomy and calling of women themselves. If the highest calling is to attain this position that's attached to the male pastor, what about their own sense of calling?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So, an argument that you would often see, like, for example, for people who don't know, I read in the Southern Baptist Convention, and the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant denomination in North America, and second only to Catholicism. So it's the second largest. And right now, it used to have 16 million members. Now it's around 13 million members because they've been losing people. But over 30,000 independent churches that are all part of this network. And so they had, with their annual convention, they started in the 1950s a pastor's wife convention. And so these pastor's wife kept these documents. And this is one of the things that I read as research for this book. And in fact, this is still going on. So it's still an ongoing conference. It's not really a conference. It's just a one-day event. But this is a conversation that these women had frequently. Is being a pastor's wife a calling? Or is it just something that did you just marry a job? Or is this actually a calling from God? And as you move closer and closer to the 2000s, the consensus is that this is a calling. That, in fact, Dorothy Patterson, who was the wife of one of the most important people in the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, and also started a series of courses for pastors' wives at Baptist seminaries. She wrote a book called A Handbook for Pastor's Wife, first published in 2001, and then a later edition was released of it. But in that book, she says that God never has separate plans for a husband and a wife. And so if a husband is called to ministry, that means that God has called the wife to ministry too. And so the idea is that this actually is a separate, set-apart calling to be in this dependent ministry position on your husband.
And this is kind of as well mentioned to young women when they're engaged to a training pastor, potential pastor. You better be called as well.
That's exactly right. That is something. And in fact, one of the books that I read, I talk about in the beginning, it's called High Call, High Privilege. And it was one of the first books I read as a pastor's wife. She was working really hard to help women. I'm actually very sympathetic to these pastor's wife books because most of them are women trying to help women in this really strange role. And so in this role, she says that the role is hard and that a lot of women really struggle within it. But often she has found that it's because a woman hasn't fully surrendered herself to the role and that she hasn't given herself over to do it entirely, which makes her exhausted because she's trying to do it out of her own work instead of out of the power of God. And so it's this idea that if ministry work is hard, if being a minister's wife is hard, it's because you haven't surrendered yourself fully to God for it. And so it puts the blame on the pastor's wife that she's not doing this right. Gail McDonald, that's her name. But I don't think she meant it to be a chastisement against women. I think it's honestly what she came to believe, that this job is so hard, it has to be a calling from God. And the only way to do it is if you are fully pulling from the power of God.
In a lot of your work, there is this kind of historical research, particularly within the SBC itself. And so you see this pattern unfolding of the growing prominence of this position of the pastor's wife. And it brings me to a question about the way that sometimes our cultural practices within the church become so prevalent that we kind of conflate them with biblical practice.
Yeah.
So how is this true? And it was interesting, the question that you posed, which I found great, was where is Peter's wife?
Yes. Yes. This is the thing that I think is so hard for people, and is we want to, as people of Scripture, we want to believe that our theology is firmly grounded in Scripture, and it's faith alone, it's Scripture alone, right? Yeah. But what we don't like to realize is how much our understanding of Scripture is actually informed by our culture, by our historical context. And so, for example, Peter's wife is a really good example of this because the model of a pastor's wife is upheld as the highest biblical calling for women. It's the model of biblical womanhood, which is, of course, what I tackled in the making of biblical womanhood. And but the problem is that it's completely absent from the Bible. Not, the closest you get to it is that more conservative interpretation, or actually more taking like the household codes and 1 Timothy 2 and reading the most restrictive readings of those passages and saying that women are called to, that women are to submit to male authority, and that includes not even teaching in churches, and so not the pastoral role at all. The problem is, though, that very restrictive reading does not match with what we see throughout the rest of the Bible. And this model of pastor's wife just is a glaring example of this. Because throughout these books that I read, one of the things I found is that the authors really scrambled to try to find biblical justification for this role. And so it was all over the map what they would choose to draw from as biblical justification for this role. Perhaps the weirdest one was Dorothy Patterson, again, who tried to explain Priscilla as a pastor's wife, as following the ministry of her husband, which is not a biblical take at all. There's no, her name is mentioned first 4 out of 6 times, which suggests, if anything, she's the lead ministry partner in here. I think if even Dorothy Patterson, who I've called the queen of the pastor's wife role, if she can't find a direct biblical model for this in the Bible, and again, Peter's wife is about the closest we get, because we know Peter was married. We know that because he has a mother-in-law. And we know that there is one passage which Paul references potentially the disciples bringing along believing wives, like Peter, on their journeys. Possibly. That's not the only, it could also just be women in ministry who are accompanying these men. So it's unclear even then. So Peter is the only one that we don't even know her name, but we know for sure he was married. And yet that's all we know about her. We don't know anything else about her. And so again, it just really proves this point. And in fact, I think I say in that chapter, I say Peter's wife simply isn't there. And that's my point. There is no biblical model for this role.
Yeah. Well, this is as well part of a wider conversation about the denial of the existence of women leaders in the Bible and throughout church history. So why do you say that this idea that women historically, and I should say this is your discipline, you are a historian, why would you say that idea that they were not ordained as leaders in their own right is wrong as we look back over church and biblical history?
Yeah, this is always, I love this. When people come, the 2 questions that people always think are gotcha questions when they're talking to me. One is 1 Timothy 2. It's like, what do you got to do with this? Everything you say is, if you can't get past 1 Timothy 2, it doesn't matter what else you say. And then the other one is ordained women. People name me one ordained woman in the past who was ordained with the same type of position and power as men. And I'm like, sure, I can name one for you. In fact, I wrote a whole chapter on her in this book. Her name was Milburga, and she was ordained by the Archbishop of Canterbury to a job that essentially was that of a bishop. And then, of course, they'll say, oh, but being ordained, she didn't perform the sacraments at the altar. And I'm like, well, we actually do know that women in the early medieval world performed the sacraments at the altar, because we know that there were some people complaining about women serving at the altar, which means that some people were supporting these women. Complaints against women mean that, some people have been upset about this, but it also means that there were people who were supporting these women. And in fact, I was just at a conference in Chicago that was on the visual imagery of women in the early church. And it just showed image after image that we know of women serving at the altar with men in the earliest years of Christianity. So the question, of course, is what happened? And what happened is that the rules of ordination changed over time. In fact, I would argue that most denominations do not interpret ordination in the same ways. And so ordination is a historically constructed position. But there are some big shifts in this position, and perhaps the biggest shift that helps us get to where we are today happened in the Central Middle Ages, in which the church, in an attempt to separate itself from the control of ordinary people, non-clergy people, began to insist that ordained clergy had to be celibate men. And part of this was the influence of monasticism, and only celibate men could perform the sacrament at the altar. And this is the first time that we get sacramental theology absolutely connected to this idea of ordination. Now, as I said, they sort of are both evolving along similar trajectories. So there's more to the story in this. But what we know is that by the time we get to the Central Middle Ages, the priest has become the most powerful ecclesiastical position because it's the only one that can perform the sacrament at the altar. And to be a priest, only celibate men are supposed to be in that job. And so this is when we begin to see women really written out of being able to consecrate and stand at the altar.
Even you get this idea then that women, even in their bodies, are not holy. They're something to be avoided, so they don't stain the male priests.
Yeah. And, in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, I tell one of my favorite stories I tell undergrads, where you have that blue line in Durham Cathedral. And the legend is that line was drawn there and that women could not pass. Now, that's actually a little bit more folklore. I talk about it. I have a long footnote in the Making of Biblical Womanhood about it. But nonetheless, it's this idea that women are dangerous because if celibate priests are required to perform the sacrament at the altar, the miracle at the altar, then women's sexuality becomes dangerous because it can challenge that sacramental power of a priest. And so this is also when we begin to see a lot of the taboos really against women at the altar. This is also when we begin to see women's ecclesiastical power within monasticism diminish. And this is when we begin to see female monastic houses having to become reliant on male monastic houses to perform the sacraments. But it isn't until this Central Middle Age period, and even then, Hildegard of Bingen is, perhaps the last gasp of these really powerful female monastics, because she goes on preaching tours throughout Europe and clearly exercised the same type of authority as men. But people like Hildegard are going to become less as these rules about ordination change.
So when we hit the Reformation, this attempt to make male ministers celibate kind of breaks apart, and then you have the initial seeds of this idea of the pastor's wife growing out of that. Right?
I actually love this part of the story, and I think this is a part. I tell people that the Making of Biblical Womanhood was a story I knew. It's what I've been teaching in the classroom for a long time. Mm-hmm. Becoming the pastor's wife is a story I didn't know. I knew pieces of it, but I had not gone in and really done the research and pieced the story together. And so what I didn't realize is that the pastor's wife role was not only born in the Reformation, but it was actually a symbol of resistance. The pastor's wife was the embodiment of the success of Reformation ideals. And I'm resisting using the word evangelism, although that's the word that they would have used at the time. Yeah. It's different from now. But these evangelical priests who put aside their Catholic calling and became Protestant ministers, the way that they solidified their commitment to evangelicalism, where people recognized their calling and their shift, was by getting married. And so this is the first time that we see marriage become an identifier for being a minister. This is the first time where it really gets written into the job description, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So they literally embody the beginning of this new movement. And many of these women who chose to marry priests, and I'm building on the research of a great book called From Priest's Whore to Pastor's Wife, which is written about, it's a great title, in 16th century Germany. And it talks about how many of these women who chose to marry these renegade priests lost their lives for it. The challenges they also faced in the community, because for so long, sharing a bed with a priest was equated with being a whore and being equated with not being a good woman. And here we have these women who were risking that reputation because they believed in in this new Protestant, what becomes Protestantism. And so they really are a symbol of resistance and hope for the beginning of the Protestant movement.
As it progresses, though, you begin to see some pretty harrowing stories of women's lives being subsumed into their husbands' lives, and almost becoming completely hidden in the background. Their concerns, their issues are take exactly a back seat. Right. Yeah, so maybe we can talk about some of the ways that takes place.
Yeah, so what I really want people to hear from this is that this evolution of what we know of the pastor's wife role today, the way she looks today, is very modern, very, very modern. And so even though we do begin to see, there's similar continuities, because being married to a pastor was similar to being married to any Protestant person in the early modern world. And so she looks like, the early modern wife was becoming more associated with home and domesticity, and labor in the household was becoming increasingly gendered female across this time period. And so in some ways, the pastor's wife takes on a lot of these similar markers of upper middle class domesticity. But we also see that the pastor's wife in this really up through the 19th century has more than one option. And I tell a couple of great stories in the book, like one of my favorite, Scotland, you'll like this, the one about the 17th century wife of a local pastor whose family, her husband sided against her father over in one of the Burger Wars, one of the disagreements. And she became so mad when she found out what her husband had done that she said, "I'm still your wife, but you are no longer my pastor." And every Sunday morning from that time, the story is that her, and Margaret Watts tells this story in her book, The Parson's Wife. And every Sunday morning, her husband would go out and help his wife onto his horse, where she would ride across town to another church. And so it's this idea that, she wasn't expected to even support her husband's ministry, that her marriage wasn't part of the deal. I mean, I just love that story. And then I tell another story closer to home, literally a church that's not very far from where I live now in Waco, Texas, about a woman named Delilah Morrill in the 19th century who married a pastor. He was a circuit rider, so he rode around to many different churches and preached, but he also helped found this church, Little River Baptist Church, with his wife. But she got really tired of him being gone all the time, and so she divorced him. And, this is crazy because the church didn't kick her out for divorcing the pastor. They actually kicked the pastor out. And he no longer came to that church. He moved, and Delilah stayed at that church. And in fact, her tombstone in that church cemetery is the tallest and the most recognizable one. And so it shows that the pastor's wife was not always subsumed under this identity of her husband. It's really the 20th century, especially the aftermath of World War II, where we see in the Western world the shift to normalize things and to get men back into jobs who have come from this horrific ordeal. And what do you do with all the women who are now in these jobs because the men were at war? And so we begin to see, and we see this in the UK also, there's this sort of this patriotic appeal that women to help their country need to go back to the home. And this is, in the 50s and the 60s. And so this is when we really begin to see the pastor's wife begin to become subsumed under the identity of her husband. And what makes her different from, say, the wives of other men in other jobs? For example, one of the women I quote, she says, yeah, in some ways the pastor's wife is like being married to a lawyer or a doctor or even a politician. But at the end of the day, when the husband gets the degree, the wife is not expected to go into surgery with him. And this is what makes the pastor's wife role different is because it begins to be emphasized that the pastor's wife, to be married to a pastor, means to have been called by God into that role. And seems no coincidence to me that the beginning of the pastor's wife, this language for calling for the pastor's wife, also begins to build with a backlash against women moving into ordained pastoral ministry. And so almost the church, this messaging to women that if you are called by God to ministry, what you are called to do is to, and I quote here, to hold the ladder for your husband to climb instead of climbing the ladder yourself. And that Dorothy Patterson makes that analogy in Becoming the Pastor's Wife, uses that metaphor in Becoming the Pastor's Wife. So that was a long answer for you. I can expand upon it more.
That was great. Well, I think there's the horror as well of women's voices being silenced in order to protect the ministry of pastors, whether they're married to them or in other circumstances. You describe a couple of situations where that took place, and so it's not even just about the inability to fulfill an individual calling, but it's that actually the male ministry is what really matters.
Becomes privileged. That's exactly right. And this rises with this theology that we see really birth. It starts to birth in the late 1970s. It is no coincidence in the U.S. that it goes along with what we call the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. And, I tell my students, I teach suffrage, which is becoming an increasingly important class to teach, I think. But I teach suffrage, and my students are always shocked when they find out that Barbie, who now has been immortalized in that really fantastic movie, but that Barbie had a dream house before women in the U.S. could take out loans in their own name to get mortgages. And so, and Barbie's house also didn't have a kitchen when it first came out, which I think and it only had a bedroom for her. No one else, it was her house. And so in some ways, it kind of embodies that women were struggling to be able to have equal credit opportunities. We're struggling to be able to hold jobs even after they got married and have children. In the U.S., women were routinely fired once they became pregnant. Or got married because it was seen that was no longer their job. And so we see these women as they're fighting for these equal rights to be able to legally hold the jobs that they feel called to do, is also when we see the church beginning to emphasize this theology that says, no, God's primary call for women is actually in the home to support the work of their husbands, not to do this work outside the home themselves. And so these two things, I think, again, this is one of those things where people say, no, I just believe the Bible. This is what the Bible says. And I'm like, did you know that people never interpreted those verses like 1 Timothy 2 in such a absolute, rigid, unilateral way until the era of the Equal Rights Amendment? I'm like, that doesn't seem an accident to me. This is the most restrictive interpretation of those types of 1 Timothy 2 being applied against women that we see in Western church history. And it begins to emerge at the time when women are finally starting to get equal rights in law and broader culture. And this is when the church begins to work backwards against it. I think it's also no accident that we see more women in the U.S. moving into wanting to go to seminary for theology and to get Masters of Divinity degrees with the idea of becoming pastors themselves. And this, again, is when we see this rise of this theology that says, no, women are called only to support men. And so what you end up with are these ecclesiastical institutions that have no female voices in them at the top, and that are in some ways constructed in a defensive way. Like God only calls us to this role and we have to defend that. And, you can think about parallels with the Catholic Church with their sex abuse scandal. We got to protect these men at the top. And so what you end up creating is an institution that protects the people in power instead of protecting the victims of the people in power. which, parallels with Catholic Church and also parallels with what we see in the evangelical world. The Southern Baptist Convention in the U.S. is a great poster child of this, but I think maybe in the U.K. we've seen some of this also lately. Maybe even the resigning of a really powerful position, a man who was complicit in some of these cover-ups.
Yeah. Well, let's, as we kind of come near the end of our chat here, if we could talk maybe a bit more kind of directly to the people that are listening, just a few things. I think there still remains a stigma around unmarried people leading and pastoring. In particular, you mentioned it earlier, single women who would look to plant or pastor churches. So what would you say to those who find themselves in that situation?
I really want those women to know that God has always called women to these types of roles, and that God calling women to these roles has not depended upon their marital status. That we see, in fact, most of the women that we see in the Bible serving in ministry, and we have to remember that in the biblical text itself, we see women serving in every role that a man is in, from prophets in the Old Testament to apostle, to deacon, and to house church leader, and even to disciple. I mean, we know, Mary Magdalene was clearly serving in the same type of position as the male disciples, from what we know from the text. So very few of those women do we actually know anything about their marital status. And when we do know something about their marital status, their husbands are not involved. One of the few exceptions of this is Priscilla and Aquila, which is why it gets so much attention and why people fight really hard to make Priscilla be subordinate to Aquila's authority, even though that's not a reading in the text, because it's really the only example we get. The only other example we get of, I think, a husband-wife team, so to speak, is Sapphira and Ananias, which is not a great example. But Nije Guapta points out and tell her story that, what's fascinating is that even though they are married and they committed this theft together, or this cover-up, it wasn't really theft until they tried to hide it, cover up together. But when they are dealt with separately. They don't come in, the wife isn't covered by her husband. She is held just as complicit as he is, which is actually really fascinating. Our really only two examples of biblical couples working together for better or for worse are of women who seem to be on equal footing with their male partners. And that's, so, I think God calls us regardless of whether or not we're married. And we are called to do what we have been called to do.
Well, and I think there's some encouragement and empowerment to be taken from some of the things you described in your book and the historical figures that have been there and held those positions. And so maybe looking to the past is one way that we can kind of determine some steps forward for the future.
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons why we're not told these stories of the past is because they do provide empowerment. And I mean, thinking about U.S. politics right now, one of the reasons why stories of women and people of color are being taken down from websites is because these stories do empower people, that, knowing who has gone before us and how God has used them gives us courage to move forward ourselves.
Yeah. I think one thing people should not hear you saying is that if you're married to a pastor, you don't need to support them. Like, just go off and do your own thing and let them do their thing. So I think maybe we could talk to those who are spouses of pastors. How can they navigate that challenge of both supporting their spouses as well as pursuing their own God-given ministry? And it should be said, sometimes there are couples who are called together to pastor together. Yeah.
I think this is one of the reasons why maybe God called me to write this book, because I am a happy pastor's wife. I've had really weird things throughout. Now I understand the role a lot better, but I never felt called to ministry myself. I'm clearly called to be a professor, to be a historian in my vocation. But I've also always loved the opportunity to serve in ministry in sort of an ad hoc basis, where I can do what I can, where I feel like my gifts match best, but I don't have to always do it. And so I think that there are a lot of women and men married to ministers who can use their gifts in those ways to support. And, we're all called to ministry. All of us are called to ministry. And in fact, we all should be doing these same types of things, and in marriage, you're called to support one another. And so this is something, but it's not a one-way street. I think that's what we are hearing. The pastor's wife role has been sold, especially in the past 30 years, as almost being a one-way street. That your husband is called by God, and so you are called by God to serve him. And that is not what we see biblically accurate. God calls both of us, and our roles may vary. And sometimes our roles, like my role, fits really well with that supportive wife role, because that's where I feel my gifts are best, but it doesn't always do so. So I would say, do what God has called you to do, as well as supporting your spouse in your ministry, which is what we all should be doing if we are married.
Yeah. One last question while I have you here. You've not had the easiest of times speaking out about patriarchal culture in churches. What encouragement can you give to other women and male allies who find the going tough sometimes in challenging the exclusion of women from leadership?
Gosh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think the fact that I'm still standing and I wrote a second book that hit the New York Times is maybe encouragement that that we can do this. We can do this. I think also, I know how hard it is to be in a church that doesn't support women in ministry, and how hard it is even for men who are trying to speak up and advocate for women in those roles. But yet at the same time, we can't make progress unless we keep trying to move forward, trying to move the needle forward. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, and every little step forward matters. And I have seen, people tell me all the time that they use the Making of Biblical Womanhood to actually, in studies in their churches, that moved their churches to supporting women, to becoming what they would consider to be egalitarian theology today. And so this is working. It is moving the needle. And so I would say for people who are in those spaces and those really hard spaces, find communities of people who support this mission. Get involved with communities of people who support this mission, who can give you encouragement as you are living out this calling in whatever space you are. So I made it this far because of the communities around me that have supported me.
That's really helpful. Well, Beth, thank you for the time that you've given us, and really recommend people pick up Becoming the Pastor's Wife, and also the Making of Biblical Womanhood. I think they work really well, and there's some connection, between the two. So go and dig into those and have a read. But really thankful for all that you're doing, and just for getting to chat with you.
Oh, thanks for having me.